Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Read by Kate Winslet. The family of Dashwood had been long settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park. The late owner of this estate was a single man, who lived to a very advanced age, and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death produced a great alteration in his home, for to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their father's inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal. The old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son, but to his son and his son's son, a child of 4 years old, it was secured in such a way as to leave to himself no power of providing for those who were more dear to him. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child. He meant not to be unkind, however, and, as a mark of his affection for the 3 girls, he left them £1,000 apiece. Mr. Dashwood's disappointment was, at first, severe, but his temper was sanguine, and he might reasonably hope to live many years. But the fortune, which had been so tardy in coming, was his only 1 12-month. He survived his uncle no longer, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widow and daughters. His son was sent for, and Mr. Dashwood recommended the interest of his mother-in-law and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but he promised to do everything in his power to make them comfortable. He was not an ill-disposed young man, and less to be rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. Had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made still more respectable than he was. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. No sooner was his father's funeral over than Mrs. John Dashwood, without sending any notice of her intention to her mother-in-law, arrived with her child. Mrs. John Dashwood had never been a favourite with any of her husband's family, but she had had no opportunity, till the present, of shewing them with how little attention to the comfort of other people she could act when occasion required it. So acutely did Mrs. Dashwood feel this ungracious behaviour, she would have quitted the house for ever, had not the entreaty of her eldest girl induced her first to reflect on the propriety of going. Eleanor, this eldest daughter whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment, which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counsellor of her mother. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. Marianne's abilities were, in many respects, quite equal to Eleanor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. Elinor saw with concern the excess of her sister's sensibility, but by Mrs. Dashwood it was valued and cherished. They encouraged each other now in the violence of their affliction. They gave themselves up wholly to their sorrow, and resolved themselves against ever admitting consolation in the future. Elinor, too, was deeply afflicted, but still she could struggle, she could exert herself. She could consult with her brother, could receive her sister-in-law on her arrival, and treat her with proper attention. Margaret, the other sister, was a good-humoured, well-disposed girl, but as she had already imbibed a good deal of Marianne's romance, without having much of her sense, she did not, at 13, bid fair to equal her sisters at a more advanced period of life. Mrs. John Dashwood now installed herself mistress of Norland, and her mother and sisters-in-law were degraded to the condition of visitors. As such, however, they were treated by her with quiet civility, and by her husband with as much kindness as he could feel towards anybody beyond himself, his wife, and their child. Mrs. John Dashwood did not at all approve of what her husband intended to do for his sisters. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy would be impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree. She begged him to think again on the subject. "It was my father's last request to me," replied her husband, "that I should assist his widow and daughters."
"He did not know what he was talking of, I dare say. 10 to 1, but he was light-headed at the time."
"But something must be done for them whenever they leave Norland and settle in a new home."
"Well, then, let something be done for them, but that something need not be £3,000.
Perhaps, then, it would be better for all parties if the sum were diminished 1/2. £500 each would be a prodigious increase to their fortunes. As it is, without any addition of mine, they will each have above £3,000 on their mother's death."
"It strikes me that they can want no addition at all. They will have £10,000 divided amongst them."
"That is very true. I do not know whether it would not be more advisable to do something for their mother while she lives rather than for them. My sisters would feel the good effects of it as well as herself. 100 a year would make them all perfectly comfortable."
"It is better than parting with £1,500 at once, but I would not bind myself to allow them anything yearly. It may be very inconvenient some years to spare 100 or even £50 from our own expenses."
"I believe you are right, my love. A present of £50 now and then will prevent their ever being distressed for money."
"To be sure it will. Indeed, to say the truth, I am convinced within myself that your father had no idea of your giving them any money at all. The assistance he thought of, I dare say, was only such as might reasonably be expected of you. For instance, such as looking out for a comfortable small house for them, helping them to move their things, and sending them presents of fish and game and so forth whenever they are in season. I'll lay my life that he meant nothing farther. Indeed, it would be very strange and unreasonable if he did."
This argument was irresistible, and he finally resolved that it would be absolutely unnecessary, if not highly indecorous, to do more for the widow and children of his father than such kind of neighbourly acts as his own wife pointed out. Mrs. Dashwood remained in Norland several months, but when her spirits began to revive, she was impatient to be gone, and indefatigable in her inquiries for a suitable dwelling in the neighbourhood of Norland. The contempt which she had felt, very early in their acquaintance, for her daughter-in-law was very much increased by the farther knowledge of her character, which half a year's residence in her family afforded. The two ladies might have found it impossible to have lived together so long, had not a particular circumstance occurred to give still greater eligibility, according to the opinions of Mrs. Dashwood, to her daughter's continuance at Norland. The circumstance was a growing attachment between her eldest girl and the brother of Mrs. John Dashwood, Edward Ferrars, the eldest son of a man who had died very rich, and some might have repressed it from motives of prudence, for, except a trifling sum, the whole of his fortune depended on the will of his mother. Edward Ferrars was not recommended to their good opinion by any peculiar graces of person or address. He was not handsome, and his manners required intimacy to make them pleasing. He was too diffident to do justice to himself, but when his natural shyness was overcome, his behaviour gave every indication of an open, affectionate heart. His understanding was good, and his education had given it solid improvement. Mrs. Dashwood now took pains to get acquainted with him. No sooner did she perceive any symptom of love in his behaviour to Elinor, than she considered their serious attachment as certain, and looked forward to their marriage as rapidly approaching. "In a few months, my dear Marianne," said she, "Elinor will in all probability be settled for life. But you look grave, Marianne. Do you disapprove your sister's choice?" "Perhaps," said Marianne. "I may consider it with some surprise. Edward is very amiable, and I love him tenderly, but yet there is something wanting. His eyes want all that spirit which at once announced virtue and intelligence. And besides all this, I am afraid, mamma, he has no real taste. The more I know of the world, the more I am convinced that I shall never see a man whom I can really love. I require so much." "What a pity it is, Elinor," said Marianne, "that Edward should have no taste for drawing." "No taste for drawing," replied Elinor. "I hope you do not consider him as deficient in general taste." Marianne hardly knew what to say. She would not wound the feelings of her sister on any account, and yet to say what she did not believe was impossible. At length she replied, "Do not be offended, Elinor. I have the highest opinion in the world of his goodness and sense." "Of his sense and his goodness," replied Elinor, "no one can, I think, be in doubt. At present I know him so well that I think him really handsome, or at least almost so. What say you, Marianne?" "I shall very soon think him handsome, Elinor, if I do not now. When you tell me to love him as a brother, I shall no more see imperfection in his face than I now do in his heart." Elinor started at this declaration, and was sorry for the warmth she had been betrayed into in speaking of him. She felt that Edward stood very high in her opinion. She believed the regard to be mutual, but she required greater certainty of it to make Marianne's conviction of their attachment agreeable to her. She knew that what Marianne and her mother conjectured one moment, they believed the next. She was far from depending on his preference of her. Nay, the longer they were together, the more doubtful seemed the nature of his regard, and sometimes she believed it to be no more than friendship. But whatever might really be its limits, it was enough, when perceived by his sister, to make her uneasy, and at the same time to make her uncivil. She took the first opportunity of affronting her mother-in-law, talking to her so expressively of her brother's great expectations that Mrs. Dashwood could not endeavour to be calm. She gave her an answer which marked her contempt, and instantly left the room, resolving that, whatever might be the inconvenience or expense of so sudden a removal, her beloved Elinor should not be exposed another week to such insinuations. In this state of her spirits, a letter was delivered to her from the post, which contained a proposal particularly well timed. It was the offer of a small house, on very easy terms, belonging to a relation of her own, a gentleman of consequence and property in Devonshire. She needed no time for deliberation or inquiry. To quit the neighbourhood of Norland was no longer an evil, it was a blessing. She instantly wrote to Sir John Middleton her acknowledgments of his kindness and her acceptance of his proposal. No sooner was her answer dispatched than Mrs. Dashwood indulged herself in the pleasure of announcing to her son-in-law and his wife that she was provided with a house, and should incommode them no longer than till everything were ready for her inhabiting it. Mrs. Dashwood took the house for a 12-month. It was ready furnished, and she might have immediate possession. No difficulty arose on either side of the agreement, and she waited only for the disposal of her effects at Norland, and to determine her future household before she set off for the West. In a very few weeks from the day which brought Sir John Middleton's first letter to Norland, everything was so far settled in their future abode as to enable Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters to begin their journey. As a house, Barton Cottage, though small, was comfortable and compact. But as a cottage it was defective, for the building was regular, the roof was tiled, the window shutters were not painted green, nor were the walls covered with honeysuckles. Perhaps in the spring If I have plenty of money, as I dare say I shall, we may think about building," announced Mrs. Dashwood. "These parlours are both too small for such parties of our friends as I hope to see often collected here." In the meantime, till all these alterations could be made, each of them was busy in arranging their particular concerns to form themselves a home. Marianne's pianoforte was unpacked and properly disposed of, and Eleanor's drawings were affixed to the walls of their sitting-room. In such employments as these, they were interrupted soon after breakfast the next day by the entrance of their landlord. Sir John Middleton was a good-looking man about 40. His countenance was thoroughly good-humoured, and his manners were as friendly as the style of his letter. He pressed them so cordially to dine at Barton Park every day till they were better settled at home, that they could not give offence. Lady Middleton had sent a very civil message by him, denoting her intention of waiting on Mrs. Dashwood, as soon as she could be assured that her visit would be no inconvenience, and as this message was answered by an invitation equally polite, her ladyship was introduced to them the next day. They were, of course, very anxious to see a person on whom so much of their comfort at Barton must depend. Lady Middleton was not more than 6 or 27. Her face was handsome, her figure tall and striking, but she was reserved, cold, and had nothing to say for herself beyond the most commonplace inquiry or remark. Conversation, however, was not wanted, for Sir John was very chatty, and would not leave the house without securing their promise of dining at the park the next day. Barton Park was about half a mile from the cottage. The house was large and handsome, and the Middletons lived in a style of equal hospitality and elegance. Sir John was a sportsman, Lady Middleton a mother. He hunted and shot, and she humoured her children, and these were their only resources. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters were met at the door of the house by Sir John, who welcomed them to Barton Park with unaffected sincerity. They would see, he said, only one gentleman there besides himself, a particular friend who was staying at the park. He hoped they would all excuse the smallness of the party, and could assure them it should never happen so again. Luckily, Lady Middleton's mother had arrived at Barton within the last hour, and as she was a very cheerful, agreeable woman, he hoped the young ladies would not find it so very dull as they might imagine. Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, was a good-humoured, merry, fat, elderly woman who talked a great deal. Colonel Brandon, the friend of Sir John, was silent and grave. His appearance, however, was not unpleasing, in spite of his being, in the opinion of Marianne and Margaret, an absolute old bachelor, for he was on the wrong side of 35. In the evening, as Marianne was discovered to be musical, she was invited to play. Her performance was highly applauded. Colonel Brandon, alone of all the party, heard her without being in raptures. He paid her only the compliment of attention. The Dashwoods were now settled at Barton, with tolerable comfort to themselves. The whole country about them abounded in beautiful walks. The high downs invited them from almost every window of the cottage, and towards one of these hills did Marianne and Margaret one memorable morning direct their steps, attracted by the partial sunshine of a showery sky. Suddenly the clouds united over their heads, and a driving rain set full in their face. Chagrined, they were obliged to run with all possible speed down the steep side of the hill which led immediately to their garden gate. They set off. Marianne had at first the advantage, but a false step brought her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret, unable to stop herself to assist her, was involuntarily hurried along and reached the bottom in safety. A gentleman carrying a gun, with 2 pointers playing around him, was passing up the hill when the accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to her assistance. Perceiving that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary, took her up in his arms without farther delay, and bore her directly into the house whither Margaret was just arrived. Eleanor and her mother rose up in amazement at their entrance. Mrs. Dashwood thanked him again and again, and begged to know to whom she was obliged. His name, he replied, was Willoughby, and his present home was at Allenham, from whence he hoped she would allow him the honour of calling tomorrow to inquire after Miss Dashwood. The honour was readily granted, and then he departed. His manly beauty and more than common gracefulness were instantly the theme of general admiration. Sir John called on them as soon as the next interval of fair weather that morning allowed him to get out of doors, and Marianne's accident being related to him, he was eagerly asked whether he knew any gentleman of the name of Willoughby at Allenham.
"Willoughby?" cried Sir John. "What? Is he in the country? That is good news."
"You know him, then?" said Mrs. Dashwood.
"Know him? To be sure I do. As good a kind of fellow as ever lived, I assure you."
"But who is he?" said Elinor. "Has he a house at Allenham?" On this point Sir John could give them more certain intelligence, and he told them that Mr. Willoughby had no property of his own in the country, that resided there only while he was visiting the old lady at Allenham Court, to whom he was related, and whose possessions he was to inherit. Marianne's preserver, as Margaret styled Willoughby, called at the cottage early the next morning to make his personal inquiries, and everything that passed during the visit tended to assure him of the sense, elegance, mutual affection, and domestic comfort of the family to whom accident had now introduced him. Of their personal charms he had not required a second interview to be convinced. Miss Dashwood had a delicate complexion, regular features, and a remarkably pretty figure. Marianne was still handsomer. Her form, though not so correct as her sister's in having the advantage of height, was more striking. It was only necessary to mention any favourite amusement to engage her to talk. They speedily discovered that their enjoyment of dancing and music was mutual, and that it arose from a general conformity of judgment in all that related to either. "Well, Marianne," said Elinor, as soon as he had left them, "for one morning, I think you have done pretty well. You have already ascertained Mr. Willoughby's opinion in almost every matter of importance."
"Elinor," cried Marianne, "is this fair? Is this just? Are my ideas so scanty?"
"My love," said her mother, "you must not be offended with Elinor. She was only in jest. I should scold her myself, if she were capable of wishing to check the delight of your conversation with our new friend." Marianne was softened in a moment. Willoughby, on his side, gave every proof of his pleasure in their acquaintance, which an evident wish of improving it could offer. He came to them every day. He was exactly formed to engage Marianne's heart. They read, they talked, they sang together. His musical talents were considerable, and he read with all the sensibility and spirit which Edward had unfortunately wanted. In Mrs. Dashwood's estimation, he was as faultless as in Marianne's, and Elinor saw nothing to censure in him but a propensity of saying too much what he thought on every occasion. Colonel Brandon's partiality for Marianne, which had so early been discovered by his friends, now first became perceptible to Elinor, when it ceased to be noticed by them. She saw it with concern, for what could a silent man of 35 hope, when opposed by a very lively one of 25? Perhaps she pitied and esteemed him the more because he was slighted by Willoughby and Marianne.
"Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day, when they were talking of him together, "whom everybody speaks well of, and nobody cares about." "That is exactly what I think of him," cried Marianne.
"Do not boast of it, however," said Elinor, "for it is injustice in both of you. He is highly esteemed by all the family at the Park, and I never see him myself without taking pains to converse with him." Little had Mrs. Dashwood or her daughters imagined when they first came into Devonshire that so many engagements would arise to occupy their time as shortly presented themselves. The private balls at the Park then began, and parties on the water were made and accomplished as often as a showery October would allow. In every meeting of the kind Willoughby was included. Elinor could not be surprised at their attachment. She only wished that it were less openly shown. This was the season of happiness to Marianne. Her heart was devoted to Willoughby. As Elinor and Marianne were walking together the next morning, the latter told her sister, with the greatest delight, that Willoughby had given her a horse, one that he had bred himself on his estate in Somersetshire, and which was exactly calculated to carry a woman. Without considering that it was not in her mother's plan to keep any horse, that if she were to alter her resolution in favour of this gift, she must buy another for the servant, and keep a servant to ride it, and after all, build a stable to receive them, she had accepted the present without hesitation, and told her sister of it in raptures. "He intends to send his groom into Somersetshire immediately for it," she added, "and when it arrives, we will ride every day. You shall share its use with me. Imagine to yourself, my dear Eleanor, the delight of a gallop on some of these downs." Most unwilling was she to awaken from such a dream of felicity, to comprehend all the unhappy truths which attended the affair, and for some time she refused to submit to them. As to an additional servant, the expense would be a trifle. Mamma, she was sure, would never object to it, and any horse would do for him. Eleanor ventured to doubt the propriety of her receiving such a present from a man so little, or at least so lately, known to her. This was too much. "You are mistaken, Eleanor," she said warmly, "in supposing I know very little of Willoughby. I have not known him long indeed, but I am much better acquainted with him than with any other creature in the world, except yourself and mamma. It is not time or opportunity that is to determine intimacy. It is disposition alone." Eleanor thought it wisest to touch that point no more. She knew her sister's temper. Marianne was shortly subdued, and she promised to tell Willoughby when she next saw him that it must be declined. She was faithful to her word, and when Willoughby called at the cottage the same day, Eleanor heard her express her disappointment to him in a low voice on being obliged to forego the acceptance of his present. "But, Marianne, the horse is still yours, though you cannot use it now. I shall keep it only till you can claim it." This was all overheard by Miss Dashwood, and in his addressing her sister by her Christian name alone, she doubted not of their being engaged to each other. Margaret related something to her the next day which placed this matter in a still clearer light. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you about Marianne. I am sure she will be married to Mr. Willoughby very soon, for he has got a lock of her hair. Last night after tea, when you and mamma went out of the room, he took up her scissors and cut off a long lock of her hair, kissed it, and put it into his pocket-book." A party was formed this evening for going on the following day to see a very fine place about 12 miles from Barton, belonging to the brother-in-law of Colonel Brandon. But their intended excursion turned out very different from what Eleanor had expected. By 10 o'clock, the whole party were assembled at the park, where they were to breakfast. While they were at breakfast, the letters were brought in. Among the rest, there was one for Colonel Brandon. He took it, changed colour, and immediately left the room. In about 5 minutes he returned.
"No bad news, Colonel, I hope?"
said Mrs. Jennings as soon as he entered the room.
"None at all, ma'am, thank you."
"I'm particularly sorry, ma'am," said he, addressing Lady Middleton, "that I should receive this letter today, for it is on business which requires my immediate attendance in town." Colonel Brandon's horses were announced.
"You do not go to town on horseback, do you?"
added Sir John. "No, only to Hamilton. I shall then go post." He then took leave of the whole party. "Is there no chance of my seeing you and your sisters in town this winter, Miss Dashwood?" "I am afraid none at all." "Then I must bid you farewell for a longer time than I should wish to do." To Marianne, he merely bowed and said nothing, and attended by Sir John, he left the room. When Sir John returned, he joined most heartily the general regret on so unfortunate an event, concluding, however, by observing that as they were all got together, they must do something by way of being happy. It was settled that there should be a dance in the evening, and they had the pleasure of sitting down nearly 20 to table. Willoughby took his usual place between the two elder Miss Dashwoods. Mrs. Jennings sat on Eleanor's right hand, and they had not been long seated before she leant behind her and Willoughby and said to Marianne,
"I know where you spent the morning."
Marianne coloured and turned away in great confusion. Mrs. Jennings laughed heartily. They had gone to Allenham and spent a considerable time there in walking about the garden and going all over the house. Elinor could hardly believe this to be true, and as soon as they left the dining-room, Elinor inquired of Marianne about it. "Why should you imagine, Elinor, that we did not go there, or that we did not see the house? I never spent a pleasanter morning in my life." "I am afraid," replied Elinor, "that the pleasantness of an employment does not always evince its propriety." Marianne blushed at this hint, but it was even visibly gratifying to her, and after a 10 minutes' interval of earnest thought, she came to her sister again, and said with great good humour, "Perhaps, Elinor, it was rather ill-judged in me to go to Allenham, but Mr. Willoughby wanted particularly to show me the place." However, Elinor could easily conceive that marriage might not be immediately in their power, for though Willoughby was independent, there was no reason to believe him rich. Mrs. Dashwood's visit to Lady Middleton took place the next day, and 2 of her daughters went with her, but Marianne excused herself from being of the party under some trifling pretext. On their return from the park, they found Willoughby's curricle and servant in waiting at the cottage. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlour, apparently in violent affliction, with her handkerchief at her eyes, and without noticing them ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, where they found only Willoughby. "Is anything the matter?" cried Mrs. Dashwood as she entered. "Is she ill?" "I hope not," he replied. "It is I who may rather be expected to be ill, for I am now suffering under a very heavy disappointment." "Disappointment?" "Yes, for Mrs. Smith has this morning exercised the privilege of riches upon a poor dependent cousin, by sending me on business to London. I am now come to take my farewell of you." "Her business will not detain you from us for long, I hope." He coloured as he replied, "You are very kind, but I have no idea of returning to Devonshire immediately." He then hastily took leave of them all and left the room. Elinor's uneasiness was at least equal to her mother's. She thought of what had just passed with anxiety and distrust. "It is all very strange. So suddenly to be gone. It seems but the work of a moment. And last night he was with us so happy. I am persuaded that Mrs. Smith suspects his regard for Marianne, disapproves of it, and that the business which she sends him off to transact is invented as an excuse to dismiss him. He is moreover aware that she does disapprove the connection. He dares not, therefore, at present, confess to her his engagement with Marianne. It may be proper to conceal their engagement, if they are engaged, from Mrs. Smith, but this is no excuse for their concealing it from us." "Concealing it from us? My dear Elinor, is it possible to doubt their engagement?" "I confess," replied Elinor, "that every circumstance, except one, is in favour of their engagement. But that one is the total silence of both on the subject, and with me it almost outweighs every other." "You must think wretchedly indeed of Willoughby. Do you suppose him really indifferent to her?" "No, I cannot think that. He must and does love her, I am sure, but with a strange kind of tenderness if he can leave her with such indifference. You must remember, my dear mother, that I have never considered this matter as certain." "But is he not a man of honour and feeling? Has there been any inconsistency on his side to create alarm?" They were interrupted by the entrance of Margaret, and Elinor was then at liberty to think over the representations of her mother and hope for the justice of all. Marianne was awake the whole night, and she wept the greatest part of it. She got up with a headache, was unable to talk, and unwilling to take any nourishment. When breakfast was over, she walked out by herself, and wandered about the village of Allenham, indulging the recollection of past enjoyment and crying over the present reverse. Such violence of affliction indeed could not be supported for ever. It sunk within a few days into a calmer melancholy. No letter from Willoughby came, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Elinor again became uneasy, but Mrs. Dashwood could find explanations whenever she wanted them, which at least satisfied herself. "Remember, Elinor," said she, "how very often Sir John fetches our letters himself from the post. We have already agreed that secrecy may be necessary. It could not be maintained if their correspondence were to pass through Sir John's hands." Elinor could not deny the truth of this, and she tried to find in it a motive sufficient for their silence. "Why do you not ask Marianne at once," she said, "whether she is or is not engaged to Willoughby?" "I would not ask such a question for the world. Supposing it possible that they are not engaged, what distress would not such an inquiry inflict?" Elinor urged the matter farther, but in vain. One morning, about a week after his leaving of the country, Marianne was prevailed on to join her sisters in their usual walk, instead of wandering away by herself. They walked along the road through the valley, and chiefly in silence. But then they saw a man on horseback riding towards them, and Marianne rapturously exclaimed, "Is it he? Indeed it is! I know it is!" and was hastening to meet him, when Elinor cried out, "Indeed, Marianne, I think you are mistaken. It is not Willoughby." They were soon within 30 yards of the gentleman. Marianne looked again with surprise to see and welcome Edward Ferrars. He dismounted and walked back with them to Barton, whither he was purposely coming to visit them. He was welcomed by them all with great cordiality, but especially by Marianne, who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than even Elinor herself. "Have you an agreeable neighbourhood here?" he asked. "Are the Middletons pleasant people?" "No, not at all," answered Marianne. "We could not be more unfortunately situated." "Marianne," cried her sister, "how can you say so? They are a very respectable family, Mr. Ferrars. Have you forgot, Marianne, how many pleasant days we have owed to them?" "No," said Marianne in a low voice, "nor how many painful moments." Elinor took no notice of this, and directing her attention to their visitor, endeavoured to support something like discourse with him, but his coldness and reserve mortified her severely. Edward remained a week at the cottage. He was earnestly pressed by Mrs. Dashwood to stay longer, but as if he were bent only on self-mortification, he seemed resolved to be gone when his enjoyment among his friends was at the height. Never had any week passed so quickly. He could hardly believe it to be gone. He said so repeatedly. Other things he said too, which marked the turn of his feelings and gave the lie to his actions. He had no pleasure at Norland. He detested being in town, but either to Norland or London he must go. Elinor placed all that was astonishing in this way of acting to his mother's account. Vexed as she was with his uncertain behaviour to herself, "I think, Edward," said Mrs. Dashwood as they were at breakfast the last morning, "you would be a happier man if you had any profession to give an interest to your plans and actions." "I do assure you," he replied, "that I have long thought on that point. I always preferred the church, as I still do, but that was not smart enough for my family." "Come, come, this is all an effusion of immediate want of spirits, Edward. You are in a melancholy humour." "I think," replied Edward, "that I may defy many months to produce any good to me." This desponding turn of mind gave additional pain to them all, in the parting which shortly took place. Elinor found every day afforded her leisure enough to think of Edward and of Edward's behaviour with tenderness, pity, approbation, censure, and doubt. As she sat at her drawing-table, she was roused one morning, soon after Edward's leaving them, by the arrival of company. She happened to be quite alone. The closing of the gate drew her eyes to the window, and she saw a large party walking up to the door. Amongst them were Sir John and Lady Middleton and Mrs. Jennings, but there were two others, a gentleman and lady, who were quite unknown to her. As Sir John perceived her, he obliged her to open the casement to speak to him. They were now joined by Mrs. Jennings.
"How do you do, my dear? What? All alone? You will be glad of a little company to sit with you. I have brought my other son and daughter to see you."
Elinor was obliged to turn from her in the middle of her story to receive the rest of the party. Lady Middleton introduced the two strangers, Mr. and Mrs. Palmer. Mrs. Dashwood and Margaret came downstairs at the same time, and they all sat down to look at one another, while Mrs. Jennings in the meantime talked on as loud as she could of their surprise the evening before on seeing their friends. Mrs. Palmer laughed heartily at the recollection of their astonishment.
"You may believe how glad we all were to see them," added Mrs. Jennings, leaning forwards to Elinor. "But, however, I can't help wishing they had not made such a long journey of it, for you know," nodding significantly and pointing to her daughter, "it was wrong in her situation. She expects to be confined in February."
As the Miss Dashwoods entered the drawing-room of the park the next day at one door, Mrs. Palmer came running in at the other, looking as good-humoured and as merry as before.
"I am so glad to see you,"
said she, seating herself between Elinor and Marianne,
"for we go away again tomorrow. However, we shall meet again in town very soon, I hope."
They thanked her, but were obliged to resist all her entreaties.
"Oh, my love," cried Mrs. Palmer to her husband, who just then entered the room, "you must help me to persuade the Miss Dashwoods to go to town this winter."
Elinor was again obliged to decline her invitation, and by changing the subject put a stop to her entreaties. She thought it probable that as they lived in the same county, Mrs. Palmer might be able to give some more particular account of Willoughby's general character than could be gathered from the Middletons' partial acquaintance with him. She began by inquiring if they saw much of Mr. Willoughby at Cleveland, and whether they were intimately acquainted with him.
"Oh, dear, yes, I know him extremely well," replied Mrs. Palmer. "Not that I ever spoke to him, indeed. But I have seen him for ever in town. I know why you inquire about him very well. Your sister is to marry him. I am monstrous glad of it."
"Upon my word," replied Elinor, "you know much more of the matter than I do, if you have any reason to expect such a match."
"I met Colonel Brandon Monday morning in Bond Street, just before we left town, and he told me of it directly."
"You surprise me very much. Colonel Brandon tell you of it? Surely you must be mistaken."
"But I do assure you it was so, for all that. Oh, he did not say much, but he looked as if he knew it to be true, so from that moment I set it down as certain."
"Is Mr. Willoughby much known in your part of Somersetshire?" said Elinor.
"Oh, yes, extremely well. Nobody is more liked than Mr. Willoughby wherever he goes, and so you may tell your sister."
Mrs. Palmer's information respecting Willoughby was not very material, but any testimony in his favour, however small, was pleasing to her. The Palmers returned to Cleveland the next day, and the two families at Barton were again left to entertain each other, but this did not last long. In a morning's excursion to Exeter, they had met with two young ladies, whom Mrs. Jennings had the satisfaction of discovering to be her relations, and this was enough for Sir John to invite them to the park. The young ladies arrived, and he set off directly for the cottage to tell the Miss Dashwoods of the Miss Steele's arrival, and to assure them of their being the sweetest girls in the world. Sir John wanted the whole family to walk to the park directly and look at his guests. When their visit to the park and consequent introduction to these young ladies took place, they found in the appearance of the eldest, who was nearly 30, with a very plain and not a sensible face, nothing to admire. But in the other, Lucy, who was not more than 2 or 3 they acknowledged considerable beauty. "And how do you like Devonshire, Miss Dashwood?" asked Miss Steele. "I suppose you were very sorry to leave Sussex." In some surprise at the familiarity of this question, or at least of the manner in which it was spoken, Eleanor replied that she was. "Norland is a prodigious beautiful place, is it not?" added Miss Steele. "We have heard Sir John admire it excessively," said Lucy. "I think everyone must admire it," replied Eleanor. "Whoever saw the place, though it is not to be supposed that anyone can estimate its beauties as we do." Eleanor left the house without any wish of knowing them better. Not so the Miss Steeles, and to be better acquainted, Eleanor soon found was their inevitable lot. Eleanor had not seen them more than twice before the eldest of them wished her joy on her sister's having been so lucky as to make a conquest of a very smart beau since she came to Barton. "'Twill be a fine thing to have her married so young, to be sure," said she, "and I hope you may have as good luck yourself soon." Eleanor could not suppose that Sir John would be more nice in proclaiming his suspicions of her regard for Edward than he had been with respect to Marianne. Indeed, it was rather his favourite joke of the two, as being somewhat newer and more conjectural. The Miss Steeles, as expected, raised a curiosity to know the name of the gentleman alluded to. But Sir John did not sport long with the curiosity which he delighted to raise, for he had at least as much pleasure in telling the name as Miss Steele had in hearing it. "His name is Ferrers," said he, in a very audible whisper, "but pray do not tell it, for it is a great secret." "Ferrers?" repeated Miss Steele. "What? Your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? I know him very well." Eleanor heard all this with attention and surprise. She wished very much to have the subject continued, but no farther notice was taken of Mr. Ferrers' name by Miss Steele when alluded to, or even openly mentioned, by Sir John. Lucy was naturally clever. Her remarks were often just and amusing, and as a companion for half an hour, Eleanor frequently found her agreeable. But her powers had received no aid from education. Her want of information in most common particulars could not be concealed from Miss Dashwood. "You may think my question an odd one, I dare say," said Lucy to her one day as they were walking together from the park to the cottage. "But pray, are you personally acquainted with your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrers?" Eleanor did think the question a very odd one, and her countenance expressed it, as she answered that she had never seen Mrs. Ferrers. "Mrs. Ferrers is certainly nothing to me at present," continued Lucy, "but the time may come, how soon it will come must depend upon herself, when we may be very intimately connected." "Good heavens!" cried Eleanor. "What do you mean? Are you acquainted with Mr. Robert Ferrers?" "No," replied Lucy, "not to Mr. Robert Ferrers. I never saw him in my life. But," fixing her eyes upon Eleanor, "to his elder brother." What felt Eleanor at the moment? She turned towards Lucy in silent amazement. "You may well be surprised," continued Lucy, "for it was always meant to be a great secret, and I am sure has been faithfully kept so by me to this hour." Eleanor for a few moments remained silent, but at length forcing herself to speak, and to speak cautiously, she said with a calmness of manner, "May I ask if your engagement is of long standing?" "We have been engaged these 4 years." Eleanor, though greatly shocked, still felt unable to believe it. "I beg your pardon, but surely there must be some mistake of person or name. We cannot mean the same Mr. Ferrers." "We can mean no other," cried Lucy, smiling. Fortunately, they had now reached the cottage, and the conversation could be continued no farther. After sitting with them a few minutes, the Miss Steeles returned to the park, and Eleanor was then at liberty to think, and be wretched. Had Edward been intentionally deceiving her? Had he feigned a regard for her which he did not feel? Was his engagement to Lucy an engagement of the heart? As these considerations occurred to her in painful succession, she wept for him, more than for herself. Much as she had suffered from her first conversation with Lucy on the subject, she soon felt an earnest wish of renewing it. She wanted to hear many particulars of their engagement repeated again. She wanted more clearly to understand what Lucy really felt for Edward, whether there were any sincerity in her declaration of tender regard for him. But it was not immediately that an opportunity of doing so could be commanded, and though they met at least every other evening, either at the park or cottage, and chiefly at the former, they could not be supposed to meet for the sake of conversation. Such a thought would never enter either Sir John or Lady Middleton's head, and therefore very little leisure was ever given for general chat. They met for the sake of eating, drinking, and laughing together, playing at cards or consequences, or any other game that was sufficiently noisy. One or two meetings of this kind had taken place, without affording Elinor any chance of engaging Lucy in private, when Sir John called at the cottage one morning to beg in the name of charity that they would all dine with Lady Middleton that day, as he was obliged to attend the club at Exeter. The insipidity of the meeting was exactly such as Elinor had expected, and she was convinced of the impossibility of engaging Lucy's attention to attempt it. The card table was then placed, and they all rose up in preparation for a round game.
"I am glad," said Lady Middleton to Lucy, "you are not going to finish poor little Anna Maria's basket this evening." "Indeed, you are very much mistaken, Lady Middleton. I am only waiting to know whether you can make your party without me. I am resolved to finish the basket after supper."
"Perhaps," said Elinor, "if I should happen to cut out, I may be of some use to Miss Steele in rolling papers for her."
"Indeed, I shall be very much obliged to you for your help," cried Lucy.
Elinor now judged she might safely introduce the interesting subject without any risk of being heard. In a firm, though cautious tone, Elinor began. "I should be undeserving of the confidence you have honoured me with, if I felt no desire for its continuance."
"Thank you," cried Lucy warmly, "for breaking the ice. For I was afraid I had offended you by what I told you."
"Offended me? How could you suppose so? Indeed, I can easily believe that it was a very great relief to you to acknowledge your situation to me, and be assured that you shall never have reason to repent it. Your case is a very unfortunate one. You seem to me to be surrounded by difficulties. Mr. Ferrars, I believe, is entirely dependent on his mother."
"He has only £2,000 of his own. It would be madness to marry upon that, though Edward's love for me," said Lucy, "has been put to the test by our long absence since we were first engaged, and has stood the trial very well."
Elinor hardly knew whether to smile or sigh at this assertion. Lucy went on.
"I dare say you have seen enough of Edward to know that he would prefer the church to every other profession. Now my plan is that he should take orders as soon as he can, and then through your interest your brother might be persuaded to give him Norland living. That would be enough for us to marry upon."
"But," replied Elinor, "he is brother to Mrs. John Dashwood. That must be recommendation enough to her husband."
"Mrs. John Dashwood would not much approve of Edward's going into orders."
"Then I rather suspect that my interest would do very little." At length Lucy exclaimed with a deep sigh,
"I believe it would be the wisest way to put an end to the business at once by dissolving the engagement. But you will not give me your advice, Miss Dashwood?"
"No," answered Elinor with a smile which concealed very agitated feelings. "On such a subject I certainly will not." From this time the subject was never revived by Elinor, and, when entered on by Lucy, it was dismissed as soon as civility would allow. Mrs. Jennings resided every winter in a house in one of the streets near Portman Square. Towards this home she began on the approach of January to turn her thoughts, and thither she one day unexpectedly asked the elder Miss Dashwoods to accompany her. Elinor immediately gave a grateful but absolute denial for both. The reason alleged was their determined resolution of not leaving their mother at that time of year. Mrs. Jennings received the refusal with some surprise, and repeated her invitation immediately. Elinor made no farther direct opposition to the plan, and merely referred it to her mother's decision. Of being informed of the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood would not hear of their declining the offer upon her account, and insisted on their both accepting it directly. After very little farther discourse, it was finally settled that the invitation should be fully accepted. Their departure took place in the first week in January. The Middletons were to follow in about a week. The Miss Steeles kept their station at the park, and were to quit it only with the rest of the family. They were 3 days on their journey, and reached town by 3 o'clock the third day, glad to be released after such a journey from the confinement of a carriage. The house was handsome and handsomely fitted up, and the young ladies were immediately put in possession of a very comfortable apartment which had formerly been Charlotte's. As dinner was not to be ready in less than 2 hours from their arrival, Elinor determined to employ the interval in writing to her mother. In a few moments Marianne did the same. "I am writing home, Marianne," said Elinor. "Had not you better defer your letter for a day or two?" "I am not going to write to my mother," replied Marianne hastily. Elinor said no more. It immediately struck her that she must then be writing to Willoughby, and the conclusion which as instantly followed was that however mysteriously they might wish to conduct the affair, they must be engaged. Marianne could scarcely eat any dinner, and when they afterwards returned to the drawing-room, seemed anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. She had been disappointed more than once by a rap at the neighbouring door, when a loud one was suddenly heard, which could not be mistaken for one at any other house. "Oh, Elinor, it is Willoughby, indeed it is!" and seemed almost ready to throw herself into his arms, when Colonel Brandon appeared. It was too great a shock to be borne with calmness, and she immediately left the room. "Is your sister ill?" said he. Elinor answered in some distress that she was, and then talked of headaches, low spirits, and over-fatigues. Mrs. Jennings soon came in.
"Oh, Colonel," said she, with her usual noisy cheerfulness, "I am monstrous glad to see you. But pray, how came you to conjure out that I should be in town to-day?"
"I had the pleasure of hearing it at Mr. Palmer's, where I have been dining." Elinor now began to make the tea, and Marianne was obliged to appear again. After her entrance, Colonel Brandon became more thoughtful and silent than he had ever been before, and Mrs. Jennings could not prevail on him to stay long. No other visitor appeared that evening, and the ladies were unanimous in agreeing to go to bed early.
"If this weather holds much longer," said Mrs. Jennings when they met at breakfast the following morning, "Sir John will not like leaving Barton next week. 'Tis a sad thing for sportsmen to lose a day's pleasure."
"That is true," cried Marianne in a cheerful voice. "I had not thought of that. This weather will keep many sportsmen in the country." "And now," silently conjectured Elinor, "she will write to Combe by this day's post." Colonel Brandon, who had a general invitation to the house, was with them almost every day. He came to look at Marianne and talk to Elinor, who often derived more satisfaction from conversing with him than from any other daily occurrence, but who saw at the same time with much concern his continued regard for her sister. About a week after their arrival, it became certain that Willoughby was also arrived. His card was on the table when they came in from the morning's drive.
"Good God!" cried Marianne. "He has been here while we were out!"
From this moment her mind was never quiet. She insisted on being left behind the next morning when the others went out. Willoughby paid no second visit there. A note was just then brought in and laid on the table.
"For me!"
cried Marianne, stepping hastily forward.
"No, ma'am, for my mistress."
But Marianne, not convinced, took it up instantly. "It is indeed for Mrs. Jennings. How provoking!" "You are expecting a letter, then?" said Elinor, unable to be longer silent. "Yes, a little. Not much." Mrs. Jennings soon appeared, and the note being given to her, she read it aloud. It was from Lady Middleton, announcing their arrival in Conduit Street the night before, and requesting the company of her mother and cousins the following evening. Never had Marianne been so unwilling to dance in her life as she was that evening. She complained of it as they returned to Berkeley Street.
Aye, said Mrs. Jennings. We know the reason for all that very well. If a certain person, who shall be nameless, had been there, you would not have been a bit tired. And to say the truth, it was not very pretty of him not to give you the meeting when he was invited.
Invited? Cried Marianne.
So my daughter told me, for it seems Sir John met him somewhere in the street this morning.
Marianne said no more, but looked exceedingly hurt. Elinor resolved to write the next morning to her mother, and she was still more eagerly bent on this measure by perceiving that Marianne was again writing to Willoughby, for she could not suppose it to be any other person. Her letter was scarcely finished when a rap foretold a visitor, and Colonel Brandon was announced. Marianne, who had seen him from the window, left the room before he entered it. He looked more than usually grave, and sat for some time without saying a word. After a pause of several minutes, their silence was broken by his asking her, in a voice of some agitation, when he was to congratulate her on the acquisition of a brother. Elinor was not prepared for such a question, and was obliged to adopt the simple expedient of asking what he meant. He tried to smile as he replied, "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is very generally known." "It cannot be generally known," returned Elinor, "for her own family do not know of it." But she acknowledged that, though she had never been informed by themselves of the terms on which they stood with each other, of their mutual affection she had no doubt. On her ceasing to speak, he rose directly from his seat, and after saying in a voice of emotion, "To your sister I wish all imaginable happiness. To Willoughby, that he may endeavour to deserve her," he took leave and went away. Nothing occurred during the next 3 or 4 days to make Elinor regret what she had done in applying to her mother, for Willoughby neither came nor wrote. They were engaged about the end of that time to attend Lady Middleton to a party. They arrived in due time at the place of destination, and entered a room splendidly lit up, quite full of company, and insufferably hot. They had not remained in this matter long before Elinor perceived Willoughby, standing within a few yards of them, in earnest conversation with a very fashionable-looking young woman. She soon caught his eye, and he immediately bowed, but without attempting to speak to her or to approach Marianne.
"Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "He is there! He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why can I not speak to him?"
Pray, be composed," cried Elinor. At last he turned round again, and regarded them both. She started up. Marianne held out her hand. He approached, and addressing himself rather to Elinor than Marianne, as if wishing to avoid her eye, and determined not to observe her attitude, inquired in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood, and asked how long they had been in town. Marianne exclaimed in a voice of the greatest emotion, "Good God, Willoughby! What is the meaning of this? Have you not received my letters? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not then avoid it, but her touch seemed painful to him, and he held her hand only for a moment. During all this time he was evidently struggling for composure. "I did myself the honour of calling in Berkeley Street last Tuesday. My card was not lost, I hope." "But have you not received my notes?" cried Marianne in the wildest anxiety. "Willoughby, for heaven's sake, tell me what is the matter." "Yes, I had the pleasure of receiving the information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send to me," he replied, then hastily turned away with a slight bow and joined his friend. Marianne, now looking dreadfully white and unable to stand, sunk into her chair. "Go to him, Elinor," she cried as soon as she could speak, "and force him to come to me. Tell him I must see him again, must speak to him instantly." "No, my dearest Marianne, you must wait. This is not a place for explanations. Wait only till tomorrow." Marianne instantly begged her sister would entreat Lady Middleton to take them home, as she was too miserable to stay a minute longer.